Albert, I don't know when this actually happened, but somewhere along the way, the NFL has expertly managed to make itself a 12-month of the year story because we talk more NFL on this show than any other sport by far. We talk a lot of college football as well, football in general. But the NFL, it feels like every year they've just been creeping up and grabbing more and more of the calendar. And I know my audience and the sports audience in general, the NBA, the NHL, they're going on. But people are far more interested in mock drafts in the NFL than they are the actual games that other sports leagues are playing. Do you remember a moment in time where you thought, my God, these guys are geniuses, they've taken over the entire calendar? Because it's really been the last 6 or 7 years, I feel like, that's officially become a reality.
Yeah, and that's actually really been by design. I mean, if you go back, like you said, 6 or 7 years, there was actually a year when they tried to put the draft back into May.
Yeah.
And I think it was the second weekend or third weekend of May the draft was held that year. They wound up going back on that, I think, for reasons relating to TV ratings. But, I mean, they really have tried to monopolize as much of the calendar as they possibly can. And, that means because the season is only 5 months long, making a bigger deal and turning things in the season into events, and so that's, creating the legal tampering period and free agency to try to stretch that news cycle out a little bit more. It's, making a big deal out of pro days in the combine leading into the draft, which is always a big deal. It's even like making a big deal out of mini camps, and obviously you have training camp, which they've always sort of done a good job of trying to turn that into the return of the sport, in this country. And so, really you look at the calendar now, and especially if they wind up moving the hiring cycle back, which would effectively, fill the space in between the Super Bowl and the Combine, it really doesn't stop. And I can tell you as somebody who, has to overthink everything else, and, it's my life, really the only time it slows down at all is really the end of June and beginning of July. But other than that, they've pretty much filled the rest of the calendar up with stuff to talk about.
We're talking to Albert Breer. All right, I want to start with the first thing that you kind of hinted at there. There is this, Black Monday, we call it, where everybody gets fired when the regular season ends. But very oftentimes, some of the top candidates are assistant coaches on other teams. And there's always this tension about, hey, how do you interview while also preparing for the next opponent? And even if your team is going to the Super Bowl, sometimes you may lose the opportunity to be a head coach, which seems like it sets up a poor incentive. And so there is a discussion, and I actually think it's a good idea, about potentially saying, hey, we're not going to allow any hires to be made from when the season ends until the Super Bowl. Good move, bad move, likelihood that it happens?
I think they're definitely going to at least discuss it. The Bills have proposed it, so it's on the docket now. And their proposal, basically lays out like this: you can't interview anybody, and this isn't just for head coach or GM jobs. It's also for top personnel jobs and coordinator jobs. You can't interview anybody until a championship game. Then there's a 2-week window when you can't hire those people, and you can't hire those until 9 a.m. the day after the Super Bowl. And so, I think that there's a few effects they're looking for here. Number one, they do want to give the guys who are achieving at the highest level the best chance to get jobs. And they feel like it's penalized guys in those positions forever. And this year it really came to light. There were 5 guys who were in the conference championship games, 5 assistant coaches in the conference championship games who did a total of 14 interviews and landed 0 jobs. Brian Daboll and Leslie Frazier with Buffalo, Eric Bieniemy with Kansas City, Todd Bowles with the Bucs, and Nate Hackett with the Packers. And so they want to give those guys a better chance. The second piece of it is they want to slow the process down a little bit so teams don't feel a rush to hire people, like they're competing with somebody else. And so in a 2-week window where you're allowing interviews but hires can't be made, theoretically, that would allow teams to be a little bit more diligent in going through the process. And then number 3, with the diversity issue, one of the biggest things that's come up when I've talked to black coaches is that they feel like, they often get this reasoning that's, well, the owner felt more comfortable with somebody else. Well, this addresses that because now it's not like going through as much of a rush process, and if you're slowing the process down, teams have a chance to get all of their candidates. And if you really think about that part of it, it makes sense because these are supposed to be 5 and 10 year hires that teams have been making like pretty routinely in 3 or 4 days. So slowing it down does make some sense for the teams too. The flip side, and I think that this part's the obvious thing, is that, for those teams that are hiring, they'd be way behind the 8 ball, in that particular offseason. So you'd be a month behind everybody else. You'd miss the Senior Bowl as your new staff, and you'd be rushing to get ready for the combine and free agency. So I think there's going to be a really good debate on it, and I think at the very least it's going to be discussed. And if they put it to a vote, I think it's got a strong chance of passing.
We're talking to Albert Breer, Sports Illustrated NFL writer. Okay, so the NFL draft, it appears to me, you let me know if I'm wrong in this, and everybody has a different board. But it seems obviously Trevor Lawrence is going number 1 overall to Clemson, from Clemson to the Jags. And now it seems like Zach Wilson as BYU's quarterback has basically slotted in on pretty much everybody's board as the clear number 2. At this point, would you be surprised about Zach Wilson not going number 2 somehow, some form or fashion? Or do you think we still have the usual drama of an NFL offseason where now people will start to pick apart Zach Wilson's game because it's like, hey, we can't just stick with the same narrative, right? Like it's like nobody's ever consistently the best or the second best. We got to pick them apart.
I mean, I think the likelihood is that the Jets trade Sam Darnold and draft Zach Wilson second.
You would bet on that being the most likely outcome with the number 2 pick.
And I don't think it comes to a final decision, but I do think like the Jets would be willing to move Sam Darnold now if something blew them away. That offer hasn't come yet, and I know that given their druthers, they would like to see Zach Wilson and Justin Fields throw live. That's the interesting thing about this year is you didn't have the combine, so you get to first see him throw live there. None of those guys were eligible for the Senior Bowl, so you didn't get to see him throw live there. And you can't do private workouts this year. So you won't have the chance to throw them live there. So you're only going to have their pro day. The coaches, the GMs, they're only going to have their pro day to see those guys throw live. And you think about it, Clay, you are literally tying your job security to a guy when you draft him at that position that high, right? So only one chance to see him live. They still haven't seen him live. So the Jets would like to see those guys throw live. I think they've sort of kind of come to the conclusion that, there's going to be a value proposition that they're going to face in getting Wilson or someone else on a rookie contract and then maybe being able to get some value back for Sam Darnold. I don't think that Wilson's a foregone conclusion. I think he's a leader in the clubhouse. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion right now. And I can tell you, I've talked to a couple of teams about Justin Fields to sort of wonder if there's a little bit of a Justin Herbert thing going on there where, and if you remember, you follow college football closely, Herbert was on the radar for so long that eventually he wound up getting picked apart in so many different ways and got, people just overthought it, And I know that there's some feeling with NFL teams. They look at Justin Fields and they say, basically the guy has everything you want. He's, played so much football and he's been in the spotlight for so long. We've had so much time to pick him apart. Are we just overanalyzing him? And so that's something I think the Jets have to consider. And then, of course, Trey Lance is even more complicated because he didn't play this year outside of the one game. So I think the Jets are going to consider all three of those guys for the second overall pick if they wind up moving off Darnold. I'd agree that Wilson's probably the leader in the clubhouse right now.
What's Sam Darnold's trade value? If the Jets are truly going to move on and potentially take Zach Wilson or someone else at number 2 overall as their quarterback, what kind of we know the trade value of Jared Goff and Matthew Stafford, and we've seen a lot of discussion about Deshaun Watson and Russell Wilson and what they might be worth. But what is Sam Darnold worth? Do people think, hey, he could be our version of Ryan Tannehill? Do you think there are teams out there that think he's worth a 2? Is it a 3? What kind of value does he have?
Well, so, I can tell you what I know is that 8 teams have called. That's a quarter of the league. have called the Jets just inquiring about Sam Darnold. I remember asking around about this back in the fall when it looked like they were going to get Trevor Lawrence, and obviously they screwed that up. But I remember the answer I got back was roughly what Arizona was able to get Josh Rosen last year or 2 years ago, which sounds crazy now, but at the time Rosen was a real commodity, and that was a 2 and a 5. So I think they probably do maybe a little bit better than that. But maybe a 2 and a lower pick. And I think there are some teams that look at it and say, he's playing for Adam Gase. It's a complex offense. They're putting a lot on his plate on a down-to-down basis. He came into the league raw. The circumstances of New York were screwed up. The team around him wasn't very good. There are some parallels there to Ryan Tannehill, right down to the fact that he played for Gase,
Yeah.
And so I do think that there's a feeling like, and Ryan Tannehill went to a Shanahan-style offense. Well, what if Sam Darnold went to San Francisco? If you're the Niners, you're getting a quarterback who's 6 years younger and $20 million cheaper than Jimmy Garoppolo. Oh, and you have to sign your left tackle, Trent Williams, who's going to be very expensive. So I think that that's going to be sort of the sort of fit we see with Sam Darnold, where some team looks at it and says, we can get cheaper and we can get younger by bringing him in. We'll have 2 full years to look at him and decide if he's our guy of the future. And he's going to cost a whole lot less than some of the other guys that are out there on the market.
What's going on with Jimmy G? We did a big breakdown of the San Francisco 49ers situation. It's one thing if you're talking about Deshaun Watson. It's another thing if you're talking about Russell Wilson potentially replacing Jimmy G. But when the story was out there that they had talked about Teddy Bridgewater, if I'm Jimmy G's representative, I'm saying we're done here, right? Because Carolina doesn't want Teddy Bridgewater. He's a borderline, top 20, top 25 guy as a starter, and that's no insult to him, but it's kind of where he slots. He's not good enough to ever be, I don't believe, a top half guy, not bad enough to be as bad as some bottom feeder franchises have to go with. But if I'm Jimmy Garoppolo, I'm saying, hey, I missed Emmanuel Sanders. I know. I should have made that pass. If I had, we would have won the Super Bowl. And I know I've had health-related issues. But, again, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, you're going after a top 10 quarterback. That may be a little bit insulting to me, but I understand it. Teddy Bridgewater, we're done here. That's literally what I would be saying if I were his agent or if I was Jimmy G calling my agent. Fair or foul, what's going on there?
I'd be careful about the idea that was very real. That Teddy Bridgewater was going to come in as any sort of full on replacement where that's your guy. That wasn't happening. Like where he was going to be the quarterback of the future there. I think the Niners do like Jimmy Garoppolo more than it might seem at times. But philosophically, I know the way they look at this is if we have to. If there's an upgrade out there in any position, we have to look at it. So I'll take you back to what happened with Tom Brady last year. Through a couple of coaches and the staff, Tom Brady got word to the Niners that if you come after me, I'll sign with you. Remember, they're coming off a Super Bowl. He's from there, all that different stuff. So, the Niners brass sits down and they say, okay, we're going to watch all of Tom Brady's throws from the last couple of years and we're going to reconvene. They came to the conclusion after that Brady still has something left and that he could still play and he'd probably be good for the next couple of years. And they sat down and they did the exact same thing with Jimmy Garoppolo. They said, we need to figure out what we have in Garoppolo. After going through that exercise, they decided at that point Jimmy Garoppolo was a better answer for them in the present. Just where they were as a franchise, it was better for them just to stick with Jimmy Garoppolo at that point. It tells you two things. Number one, they really do like Jimmy Garoppolo. But number two, they're willing to look at an upgrade. And if that upgrade's out there, they are going to give it consideration. And so, I think that's the best illustration I can give you, Clay, of kind of the way their thought processes worked over the last year or so. They really do like Jimmy. They're not going to have their eyes closed and their fingers in their ears if a better option comes along. Whether or not Sam Darnold represents that, I can't tell you. You would think if Deshaun Watson were to become available, maybe that would be the guy. do you think really feel like, right, like with Jimmy Garoppolo where they're at, the contract's affordable, they're in a really good spot where they've got a quarterback they're happy with, but they've got the flexibility to kind of pull the ripcord whenever they need to go and get themselves an upgrade.
What are you hearing about Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson? It seems like Russell Wilson kind of went to the brink, and now he's taking a couple of steps back and saying, "Oh, by the way, maybe I'm not going to jump into this trade pool." Whereas Deshaun Watson, it seems like he's basically cannonballed in and said, "I'm done." How does this play itself out? What's the time frame? What are you hearing?
Watson's unpredictable, and I just tell you this. I mean, we know how Watson feels, and we know what he said, or at least we know the word that's gotten out from his camp that he feels like he's done in Houston. The Texans, for their part, have basically stonewalled, any sort of overtures for Watson. In fact, I've talked to a couple of teams this year when they called Nick Caserio, the general manager there. The answer they got was, "You can ask me about anybody but the quarterback." So until something changes, whether it's Watson coming in or the Texans deciding to field offers, it's just, it's hard to say. And I'd say this about that one, too. Based on having talked to some people who know Nick Caserio really well, if Watson is traded, it wouldn't shock me if it's just one of those things that kind of happens under the cover of night. You know what I mean? Like where there's no circus. It's just we wake up someday before the draft and all of a sudden, Nick spent like 3 hours the night before taking offers and he's traded.
Yeah.
As for Wilson's, to me, there's so much history there between the player and the team. And I would say this. I think he signed his last contract in Seattle. He's got 3 years left on that deal. I think that's going to be his last contract in Seattle. And I'm not sure whether or not that means he's dealt this season or next off season. But I think that he's probably in his last few years there if he's not dealt this off season. And so, I think to change that, I think what would have to happen is the Seahawks would have to be convinced that we're not going to be dealing with the year-to-year drama anymore. And that's really kind of what they're fed up with, is dealing with the year-to-year drama, the stuff with his contract, the stuff with, the defensive players a few years ago, the quiet grumbling over the years about the offensive line. I talked to somebody who knows John Schneider, their general manager, really well. I asked him, "Do you think like he's going to trade him this offseason?" The answer I got was, "It depends if John's fed up at this point." And so I think I do believe that like this will be his last contract in Seattle. I'm just not sure whether or not there's that breaking point where with a coach who's turning 70 this year, they're willing to kind of go back out and look for another quarterback.
We're talking to Albert Breer, Sports Illustrated NFL writer. A last question for you. We've talked about a bunch of different teams and their drama at the quarterback position. I got 4 teams for you: Bears, Washington, the New England Patriots, and Miami Dolphins. Do any of those 4 teams do anything in your mind that is going to surprise us between now and the NFL draft? In other words, Tua, how set is he? What do they do with Fitzpatrick? Yeah. Do the Patriots go and make any kind of move with Cam and Jarrett Stidham potentially out there trying to decide? Washington, they've kicked Alex Smith to the curb, which obviously is a public sort of divorce, which is a little bit of an ugly look, I think it's probably fair to say. And then the Bears perpetually star-crossed in Chicago, not able to figure out what's going to happen. How would you assess those 4 teams?
So I think Washington and Chicago are sort of in a spot where I don't know if they want to go in on someone they're lukewarm on. Both were involved in the Matthew Stafford sweepstakes. Neither was involved in the Carson Wentz deal. And that means what that can tell you is, like, I think both are, like, sort of looking at it. It's like the Bears with Nick Foles and Washington with Kyle Allen and Taylor Heineke, and thinking to themselves, if we need to, can we get by with this? Because we may be better off just being patient and waiting to take a big swing instead of just like hitting a double, the first week of free agency. The Dolphins, I'd say, they're going to say all the right things about Tua over the next 6 or 7 weeks. I think they absolutely have to take a look at the other 3 quarterbacks, the 3 quarterbacks that could be there at number 3, and at least hold them up against Tua. So I think whether that's quiet or that's outward, they're going to look at the other quarterbacks and hold them up against Tua because the direction that place is going, they don't expect to be drafting that high again. And there's nothing more important than getting the quarterback position right. And then as for New England, I just tell you this, Clay. If Jimmy Garoppolo becomes available, I just think there's so much mutual admiration between Bill Belichick and Jimmy Garoppolo. Bill never really wanted to trade Jimmy, that it would make just too much sense for Jimmy Garoppolo to wind up back in New England. If it's not Jimmy, it wouldn't surprise me. If it's some veteran, whether that's Marcus Mariota or something like that, and then a rookie competing with them, and maybe they wind up having Cam back as part of that competition.
Outstanding stuff as always, Albert Breer. We will talk to you again soon, I hope, and have a good week.
Awesome. Thanks, Clay.